Hello, and welcome to Praxis and Theodicy. Today, we're going to talk a bit about the various ways that an understanding of unjust usury has developed across different cultures. In a future video, we will look at how the understanding of usury has evolved throughout Christian culture and Western civilization. But first, we're going to take a step back and quickly overview how universal an understanding of usury has been throughout history and throughout different religions. A quick housekeeping note: I will be making a more concerted effort to keep videos somewhere around 10 minutes long. My very first video on usury helped me see how much page space equates to how many seconds of video time, so it was very informative. So, who cares about usury? Well, it turns out quite a lot of people, or at least quite a lot of people used to. Warnings, regulations, guidance, or prohibitions against lending at usury appear in major religions globally. In Hindi texts, 2 of the 4 social classes are prohibited from lending at interest: the priest or scholar caste and the ruler or warrior caste. The other castes, that of the merchants and that of the laborers, were not bound by this prohibition. Texts even give specific guidance on an interest rate of 8%, and even explain and allow for compound interest. In Buddhism, usury is spoken of in the Buddha's sermon on the Eightfold Path. One discerns wrong livelihood as wrong livelihood, and right livelihood as right livelihood. And what is wrong livelihood? Scheming, persuading, hinting, belittling, and pursuing gain with gain. This is wrong livelihood. While pursuing gain with gain is often translated as charging interest or charging usury, it is used to refer to any practice or habit of turning any small material wealth into greater material wealth, or seeking to increase what one has through means of coercion at all. In Buddhist monastic code, monks may be banished from a community for seeking gain upon gain, which is defined with examples as giving items of small value in hopes of receiving items with larger value in return, making investments in hope of profit, or offering material incentives to those who make donations. Islam is perhaps the most interesting cultural religious take on loaning at usury. Interest, or usury, is called riba, and I suspect that the algorithm may be pointing you towards many videos regarding riba and Islamic financial practices in the sidebar there. Riba has a specific sort of place in Islamic ethics, and is thus central to Islamic finance, even in the modern day. The Quran says that to seek interest on a loan is to find oneself at war with God and His Messenger. Countries that hold to Islamic teachings in their state legislation must practice Islamic finances, which means that riba must not be collected. In competition with the world at large, Islamic financial systems have evolved to work around this stipulation in a couple of ways. After all, in today's economy, you can't survive without at least some level of seeking wealth by means of interest. The first, in a bid for upright, just practice of money lending, insists that investors be contracted to take on risks, and thus, money that is lent for an enterprise may be returned with gain or with loss, depending on the success of the enterprise. The second workaround is on loans given to private individuals who do not produce wealth, and this workaround is a little less wholesome. In a private loan, say, for an individual to buy a home, a bank would simply buy the house and charge a rent to the occupant for a number of years, such that the total repayments end up equaling the cost of the home plus a totally not interest amount of money on top. This rent-to-own model is discouraged in certain sectors of the United States, as it was used in the 1950s and 60s to target struggling families who would pay rent for a good amount of time with the hopes of eventual home ownership, only to fail to make payments and have the house repossessed by the bank without any earned equity to start over. As a means for circumventing an unjust financial practice, the practice of renting instead of mortgaging is problematic, to say the least. Last time, we made a few mentions of the Old Testament teachings on usury. In specific, we saw that charging any interest on a loan was prohibited in many circumstances. In civil relationship within the theocratic nation of Israel, no one could charge their countrymen interest on a loan. There are a great number of specific laws and practices outlined in the book of Leviticus that regulate the use of wealth and property, but overall, these stipulations seemed to revolve around a central understanding that wealth was to be liquid, not held too stringently by the wealthy, and flowing freely to the poor and afflicted, not for the purpose of gain for the wealthy, but for the purpose of aiding those handicapped by financial hardships. But some of these laws, including the prohibition of usury, applied specifically to domestic civil interaction. Foreigners, other than immigrants and resident aliens, could be dealt with in looser terms. Seeking interest on loans to Gentiles was permitted. When Christianity formed as a sort of cultish branch of Judaism, its relationship to Jewish laws and traditions was an interesting one. Questions like, who is this religion for, and what do we believe is right living, and what should we teach each other, and to what standards should we hold each other, were all being asked from the very beginning. You can see the identity of the Christian religion forming in the book of Acts, chapters 10 and 11, and again in many of the epistles, as Jesus' disciples recognized that the kingdom of heaven is one of all nations and peoples, and the practices and traditions therein will be diverse. So a simple question is, what sort of beliefs do Christians have about carrying over the decrees of God in the Old Testament to their standards of righteous living in the kingdom that Christ establishes? Well, it may be a simple question, but it has no simple answer. There are many schools of thought surrounding this question. There is covenant theology, there is dispensational theology, there are schools of thought in both Catholic and Reformed traditions that divide law into three categories of ceremonial, moral, and civil, or judicial. The simple answer is that Christianity, at its conception, was a much more radical movement than its eventual evolution would bring it to where it seems to be today. The early church took the teachings of Jesus, especially those regarding economic justice, very seriously. The early church councils used Jesus' teachings in Luke 6:34 and 35 to be an extension of the Old Testament laws on usury, as much of Jesus' teachings were. More radical, holistic precepts to live by. They took literally his call to sell all they had. They formed societies wherein they eschewed private property in favor of mutual ownership in communion with each other. The Christian understanding of usury was boiled down to, if the law of Moses taught that I cannot lend to my brother at interest, are not all men my brothers? As Christianity grew and dwindled in turn, it would eventually see allegiance with the state in the form of Roman Emperor Charlemagne, and Christian practices would become absolute law. This authoritarian approach would see Christianity shape Western civilization, and as the taste of authoritarian rule and cultural power would, in turn, shape the course of Christianity. In the next video, we are going to explore the evolution of usury laws through the allegiance between the church and the state. But for now, I want to get back to this relationship to Judaism. You see, Judaism still practiced a more literal understanding of the Mosaic laws on usury. While they understood to refrain from the practice with each other, they would not be bound by the Christian laws that forbade citizens from the same practice. The Middle Ages in Europe saw a unique form of hostility between Jewish and Christian groups. Jews were forced by the Christian councils to wear special clothing that identified them as such. They were not allowed to own land and were given segregated living spaces within cities, one such being near the ghetto in Venice. This is where we get the modern term, ghetto, to mean a segregated area that is purposefully unmanaged and excluded by mainstream society. Jews were often barred from participating in many professions, but they were permitted to practice money lending. In fact, the officials of the growing church often used Jewish bankers to manage and transport their money, And so, the very church who harshly punished Christian citizens for lending at interest would also allow and encourage and use Jewish business owners to do so, to serve their own purposes. This sharp divide between everyday practice of not lending at usury and the Jewish practice of extracting interest from loans led to an undercurrent of strong anti-Semitism in the populace. Sure, it was there already, but this kind of mutated it. The average merchant or laborer who needed a loan would find no option but a Jewish banker, who in turn likely had no other career options in front of him. This embittered those who borrowed money from these bankers, who began to paint them all as greedy, money-grubbing scoundrels. Though this stage of life in Western civilization was over 5 centuries ago, these racist stereotypes still exist and persist today. The early Christian movement sought to create a society without property or wealth, where all things were shared in common. The authoritarian church state sought to create a society free of the injustice of usury, yet, for their needs of wealth and of financial logistics, brought in usury through a loophole, through which both the impoverished lendees and the oppressed Jewish lenders both suffered. In the next video, we'll be taking a look at how usury evolved through Christian and Western culture and law. From the early start of the church as a radical movement that rejected the accumulation of wealth, to the authoritarian regimes of the English church state, we will examine how usury went from being an act of injustice to a part of everyday life.